Hola a todos.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new edition of Wealth Talks, these exclusive Santande Private Banking talks, in which we try and share with you really current topics. I'd just say to start that the talk's going to be in Spanish, but if you want to follow it in English, you can use the tab that's on the top right of your screens where it says EN or English, and you can click on that and listen to the English.
Top right of your screens, in the button that says EN, you can change into the English translation. Thank you. A ver, hoy tenemos...
Okay, so today we have a especially important talk because if there's one burning issue around every dinner table and attracting everyone's attention lately, and in the media we see stories every day, it's artificial intelligence. And it's not just about dinner talk. In all of our meetings, discussions, at work and in the different sectors, this is on the table and everyone's wondering what is going to happen with this technology. And, well, some numbers. Google searches on artificial intelligence in the last year have tripled. And we're seeing it also in the markets. In the stock market, any company that has top of the line AI technology is performing really spectacularly. And that's why today we have the fortune of having an expert in artificial intelligence, especially in terms of what the impact of this technology will be on the economy and society. Esteban Moro is a professor at the Carlos III University and a visiting professor at MIT, where lately he's been focusing most of his work. And he's got a tremendous resume, which I'm not going to go into, but he's got a PhD in mathematical engineering and a master's in physics, and he's published innumerable studies on this topic, on the interaction between technological progress in general and our cities and work environments. And recently he's published a paper in partnership with Santander Universidades in the framework of Santander X, a paper which talks about the impact of artificial intelligence, and which you all have available in santander.com if you want to read it. And so without any further ado, welcome, Esteban. It's a real pleasure to have you here today. Thanks for coming. Well, thanks for inviting me. And I think that we hadn't had a one-on-one, face-to-face talk for a while, and all of this progress with video conferencing and so on is all very well and it's very convenient, but it's nice to finally be able to see each other face to face. So Esteban, I'd like to ask you a question to start, which must be pretty basic for you, because now everyone's talking about it constantly. But I'd like to understand, and I'm sure that everyone who's following this would like to understand what artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence is exactly, and where it fits within artificial intelligence. Because I've had some talks when people say, oh no, we use AI for whatever, and you're saying, yeah, but that's not generative AI. So what's the difference between conventional artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence? Well, generative artificial intelligence has been around for a long time, but what we're talking about these days, that's a big umbrella which includes algorithms that basically code the way in which humans communicate, or in the way in which we create images or we write. And so basically these algorithms are very easy to understand. These algorithms like ChatGPT, which is the one that everyone's talking about lately, are algorithms that try to predict the next word in a text. It's pretty easy to follow. And these algorithms become so large and so complex that they can code the patterns of human communication, and to understand not just the grammar of a sentence, but also the context for that phrase. So they can code the way in which humans communicate with one another. And those models don't just reproduce the next word in a text, but they also allow some degree of randomization, so they can create things. And that's the difference with the more traditional AI algorithms, which allow them to carry out a very specific task. For example, to predict in an X-ray whether there's a malformation or not. That's a very specific task. But these algorithms are pre-trained to create things randomly. but of course while preserving the way we communicate and the way we create images and the way we create ideas. And in that sense, generative artificial intelligence algorithms are different because they have creativity. They can create new things which were not present in the databases that we use to train them. It's really amazing that they can do such things. And by the way, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but like in all of these talks, if you have any question, send it in through the chat so that we can pick it up and ask it at the end. So going back to artificial intelligence, as I said at the beginning, this is something that everyone's talking about now, everywhere, and it is a bit overwhelming to think about everything that could happen. Because looking at the past, we have things like the internet or smartphones, which completely transformed our lives. Are we seeing a similar type of disruption? Or is it going to be a more gradual process, which is not going to really mean such a huge leap forward? Well, in science, we have what is called the grandmother's test, and that is when your grandma asks you about what you're doing in your research, that means it's present everywhere in society, and that's what happened with ChatGPT, and it's a huge change. It's not just going to change the way we work and the way we communicate, but it's being used by everyone. Very differently to what happened, for example, with the deployment of the internet or smartphones, where only a small segment of the population were initially able to benefit from those technologies. But the speed with which this type of tools have scaled up and the fact that they're universally accessible is completely different. So we're experiencing by the first time when, as the technology develops, we're already, all of us, using it. Whilst before, what happened was that by the time a smartphone got to you, it was a fully developed technology. And in that sense, it's as disruptive probably as internet or smartphones, but it has that different element, which is the speed at which it's popularized. It's true that anyone can try it and anyone can play around with it, but there's a difference, I think, between trying it and actually finding business or industrial use for it. Do you think that, and in that sense, when you want to make a professional business use of it, it's expensive still. So ChatGPT, of course, it's free to play around with, but if you want to use it for an investment advisory, that costs a fortune. And so is it really going to be that democratic, or will it be that accessible at every level? Or will the cost of specific applications mean that it will be more selective? Well, here we're talking about the last 6 months, which is a bit overwhelming because we're thinking about making forecasts with a track record of just 6 months. But it could help us to think about what's happened with the development of general artificial intelligence, not generative, where 10 years ago it was really difficult to train a machine vision or computer vision model, and costs have come down 100 times in 10 years. And for example, in the large language models like ChatGPT, the cost of training these models has gone from being $3.5 million to train GPT last year to the latest data we have, $400,000 this year. So we are already seeing that more law in place for these models. And the forecast is that this will be commoditized by 2030. The cost of these algorithms and training them will be really cheap. And obviously new things will develop and they will be more expensive, but these models will be very easy to train and the cost of training them will be really low. And there's another component of these models, and that is that they're huge. You have to think that since these models are coding how humans speak, and we speak in so many different ways, these are models that have to have a huge number of parameters, 5 billion, 10 billion, 20 billion parameters. So these are huge models, and that means that the technology to run them is special. What ChatGPT uses per month is about $7.5 million just to maintain that technology. But that also is changing. This morning, for example, I've just seen a report that they've been able to reduce the size of this model to about 20 gigas. So very soon they will fit in our mobile phones, these models, as they're simplified. And so what will happen, that's my prediction, given what's happening with the technology, is that they will be commoditized by 2030. It will be really cheap to have and to train these models. It will be very cheap to run them on any device, and they will be deployed probably in every device. And so you think that they're going to be completely democratized? Pretty much, as was the case, for example, with other AI tools. There will still be increasingly sophisticated and costly developments, but these technologies, and really in the last 6 months, what we've seen is that it's come down 1 order of magnitude, the cost, in just 6 months. And so my forecast based on that is that by 2030, basically it will be like clicking on something on Amazon. There's something that always comes up, and that's people saying, well, these machines take my job. Everyone's going to lose their jobs. Will it really be such a big impact on the labor market? And I suppose there will be sectors that will be harder hit than others. Which sectors do you think are going to be hardest hit in terms of replacing human jobs? Well, that's really our topic. That's the topic we work on, the impact of automation and AI on labor markets. And to answer that question, we have to understand what exposure to AI is in the labor market. And when we talk about jobs, you have to realize that a job is actually a collection of tasks. Essentially, a job, the way in which they're catalogued, for example, in the US or Europe, all jobs have about 20 tasks. And then what these tools do is to automate part of those tasks. They don't automate the whole job. For example, in the case of a radiologist, they will automate the part in which the radiologist has to look at the X-ray and identify whatever is there. But they don't automate the other tasks that a radiologist does. And so the impact of these artificial intelligence tools has to be understood in the sense that they do impact the tasks of a job, and some jobs have more exposure to the impact of AI tools, and there are jobs that have less exposure. And then the second part is that talking about sectors or even companies, we have to think how many people we have whose jobs are going to be hard hit. For example, there are companies that have few financial advisors, and there are companies like Santander who have many financial advisors. In fact, financial advisors are one of the hardest hit sectors because their jobs are essentially about skills or tasks that have to do with collecting data, summarizing it, coming up with predictions, which are easily replaced by these tools. And then, of course, there's the countries. Countries also have different labor employment sectors. And so we, in that paper you mentioned, have seen that there are sectors like legal, financial, education, or even medicine, which will suffer a great impact, not just because they have many people with jobs whose tasks are going to be impacted, but also they employ a lot of people with this high exposure. And then there are issues that have to do more with demographics. For example, there are some population segments that will be more affected, like, for example, women, not because they have any particular profile for some tasks, but rather because most women are employed in positions that are more exposed to being replaced by these AI tasks. In general, you mean? Well, that's the labor market we have right now. And so, for example, even in countries like, we did a study also in that paper, of countries like in Europe, the UK, Germany, Sweden, or Belgium, which are going to be suffering a much bigger impact because their legal, financial sector employs more people. So if you have more service sector, there's going to be less of an impact. Yes, our economy is more dependent on service, personal service sectors, and so they're going to be less exposed. But to understand the impact, you have to think about the tasks which can be automated and the jobs that have those tasks, and companies as a collection of jobs and countries as a collection of companies. And countries And when I talk about this, I always say that to a certain extent, you're always going to have somebody, because this will perhaps take over some low-level tasks, but you will always have to have someone looking over what's coming out of the model. Or will we get to a point when we will just trust what the AI produces? For example, in investment advisory, well, there's two things there. One is what the exposure of a job to these AI tools means. And there's obviously going to be jobs where 100% of the tasks may be done by these tools. This type of jobs, which are very few in the economy currently, may be more susceptible of being completely destroyed. But there are other jobs, and we've seen it in our analysis. Automation doesn't completely replace the worker. What it does is modify the composition of tasks in the job. For example, we've published some studies that show in the last 10 years, a lot of these jobs that have been hit by automation have completely changed the way in which they're carried out. For example, radiologists. You would have thought that with these tools, there are some tools that actually are better predictors of, say, a tumor in an X-ray than an actual radiologist. And you might think a lot of radiologists have been fired. No, actually they're hiring more and more radiologists because they can do the job better and better. Because a radiologist's job is not just to interpret an X-ray, but it's a lot more. Also, these models hallucinate. These are randomized models, and they learn to talk like humans talk, but the answer they give you is not always true, or it's not always accurate. And there's a big part which they're working on now, which is the fine-tuning of these models, where what we do is to adapt this model, which is very general. Essentially, we're hiring someone who knows a bit about everything, and we want to train them so they only know about our topic. And there are companies like, I suppose, Banco Santander and others, which are taking these general models and fine-tuning them or adjusting them so they will be more reliable or more precise when, for example, making predictions or recommendations for investment. Well, that's a really different world. But what do you think a company or a country should do to make the most of this and make sure it doesn't just end up creating fear that it will replace people? How can you prepare to receive it and to give the best possible use to these technologies? What would you recommend to the average company or a government? Well, first thing, which is what we do, is to map the exposure of that company or that country. How many employees might be affected? Which tasks will be affected? What is the number of people who will be impacted in the company, and which parts of the company? And when I talk about a company, this could apply also to a government or even to our sector, education. Which parts of the company are more exposed to being complemented or replaced by these tools? And every day in the press we read stories which are anecdotal, and what we have to do is to move from anecdotes to data, and data requires that you map the sectors in a country and that you have more global policies. And the second part is that once you've mapped it, the companies, society, and in general countries will in the next years have to make a collective effort to retrain, re-educate, relearn things, especially, for example, in the use of these tools. And some people will have the problem that they will be replaced because their jobs can be fully replaced by these technologies. And as a society, we'll have to create safety nets and retraining nets so that these people can transition to a different type of jobs. Well, we have about 800 people following us, more or less, so it seems that this has been quite a popular topic. And there's something that we always think about, and that's productivity. All of this will make us more productive, or won't it? Because I always use the example of mobile phones. Smartphones, in theory, we should be able to do a lot more than we did before, and it's true, but maybe I spend my time now answering 200 emails when in the past I only got 4 messages that were truly important. And so, yes, it's true, we're all doing more things, but I'm not sure whether we're that much more productive. And so does this really have an impact? Do you think it's going to have an impact on productivity? Or will it be like what happened with these other technologies, which mainly keep us distracted, doing other things which might not be directly translated into productivity? Well, as usual, we're on day 0 or day 1 of the deployment of these technologies. And in some studies, several research projects, for example, that by the sector of call desks and so on, say that when they adopt these technologies day to day, they do increase their productivity significantly. In call centers, it's not just 1-digit increase in productivity, but double-digit increases in productivity. Also, it seems that 15% of the tasks that are carried out in the economy could be enhanced with these types of tools. So it seems that for some sectors and some types of jobs, productivity can be enhanced. But there's other cases of other studies which indicate that average productivity increases will be 1.5% yearly in the next 5 years. But for those of us who've been studying automation, we've been asked this before, and we've been through this. And in the US, even though in the last 10 years they have deployed in companies a lot of AI, for example, with computer vision, automated translation in these language models and so on. Between 1995 and 2005, productivity in the US increased 2.3%, and in the last 10 years, it dropped to only 1.2% increase annually. So it's true that we have increasingly powerful tools, but it doesn't seem that productivity follows the same rate. And there's many reasons for that. One is the one you've mentioned, the fact that everyone's using these tools all the time means that there's no differentiation. And the second is that even though we have these tools, sometimes we don't quite deploy them or implement them in a really effective way. There's lots of barriers of all kinds, even legal, administrative, or businesses themselves have barriers to the use of these type of tools, the culture, but also organizational. So there are some proposals or predictions that are pretty reasonable and data-based in the sense that it will improve productivity, but our past experience has been that it does not mean it's going to be 50% higher or even 15% higher. Totally. You mentioned legal aspects, but there's another thing that people ask about, and in fact we've received some questions about this, which I'll ask you later, and that's about intellectual property. There's some countries like Japan which have decided that when AI uses something that's covered by intellectual property, that copyright no longer applies. And I think the EU is already also legislating in this sense, but what's going to happen with intellectual property? Do you think that the trend will be for countries to do something similar to what the Japanese have done? Or how will this work? Because it's really complex and really difficult to explain to an algorithm that it can't use something that it's found somewhere because it's copyrighted. Well, legally, there's 2 points in the use of these technologies where there's an important legal component. First, these algorithms have been trained with data, and the data, a lot of it was public. For example, these algorithms train with websites and blogs and Wikipedia, so data that are in the public domain. But also, there's some indications that they've been trained with private data, but which are somehow accessible in the public domain for particular uses. And so there, it's true that they're saying that there has to be transparency or full disclosure of what sources have been used to train these models. And that's legally very relevant because many people might say, well, I don't want these algorithms to be trained with my text, and I have full legal protection to prevent that. But then there's another thing, which is the big difference between the US and Europe, for example, and that is that what's generated by these tools resembles the original works, but it's not the original work. For example, in the US, they have what they call the quoting right. You have the right to quote a work, and you don't have to pay copyright to the person who had created that, as long as the quote is reasonable. So if with these tools I'm going to generate something that resembles, say, Pérez Reverte books, but weren't written by him, to what extent am I infringing his copyright? To what extent am I using his original text or just his style? And there's not a lot of legislation about copying the style. There's a lot about copying the content. For example, if Victor Matarranz publishes a text and I use it for commercial purposes, I have to pay you because of copyright. But if I write something in your style, there's no law covering that. So in the next years, I think we will see a lot of progress in these two aspects, in the which data are used to train these models and how can you protect copyright of the original author used to train these models, and also to what extent can we say that the work generated by these tools is different from the original. Because even forgetting about this in the everyday world today, if you do something in the style of somebody, normally there's no copyright protection, right? No. But of course, and here there's even less control. And yes, but the thing is that, as usual, it's all about the scale. Because when somebody copied somebody's style, the original author might say, well, it's just the one guy. It doesn't matter. Or maybe we can come to some arrangement. But here we're talking about generating hundreds or thousands of books a year in an author's style, which could be sold. And for example, the other day in the US, in Spotify, in fact, there was a Kanye song, which he hadn't composed or sung, but it sounded exactly like him. So to what extent is that legal? That's very, very complex. And there's something that I find quite fun, actually. You probably don't, but it's what's going to happen in the classrooms with students and research, because I'm thinking that, well, you would climb on the shelf and grab the encyclopedia. But now if you have to write a project, you can get an AI model to write it for you, to do your homework. How's that going to work in the classroom? Because it's going to be really difficult to check that they're not using this for their class projects and so on. So how's that going to work? Well, in fact, the education sector, together with the financial and the legal sector, is going to be one of the sectors that's going to suffer the greatest impact. Because basically what we do is to teach or to facilitate learning of different contents. And of course, these tools allow you to do all that. And the second part of what you were saying, which is that these tools, a lot of the assessment processes at universities and schools assess creativity. We're assessing the students' creativity, and these tools can do all of it. But I'm optimistic, because actually this year I taught my first courses with ChatGPT out there, and from the beginning I said that they could go ahead and use it. And I teach several classes, and one is about using programming tools for big data. And one of the things that has happened, and in fact we put it in the paper too, there are indications that this type of tools are actually more beneficial for people who have just arrived to a profession. Because once you have all those years of experience that you've acquired reading reports and coding and talking to your colleagues, well, these people have access to all of that already on ChatGPT. And so my students, most of the problems they had were coding problems in order to get to the final outcome. And that's no longer a problem. They no longer have to worry about that. And so it's true what you're saying, that universities, in fact, there's been a lot of talk going from, oh, that's so cool, to, oh my God, it's the end of the world. But we really have to change the way in which we assess learning. Because, of course, write me a 5-page project on the Romans is no longer going to work. We're going to have to change the way in which we assess learning. And most of the ways we assess learning are very mechanical. And so these tools are really good at that. And in fact, ChatGPT, for example, can pass an SAT, no problem. And so we have to change the way in which we assess our students. How do you do that? By not looking at the mechanical, by rote learning, but by looking at the more creative part of learning, a much more creative part of learning. And so, for example, by involving the student's personal side on how to solve a problem, by developing projects over time throughout the year, not specific tasks or specific one-off questions or projects. And we have several ways in which we can do that. And for me, the best thing is what I said, that it will help people who have these difficulties, for example, to code, or even to understand the text, or even, for example, the other day, a student of mine who did not understand the text in English. Well, put it on ChatGPT and tell it to translate into Spanish. But it will also benefit, especially, for example, for online education. We will reach a lot more people who are currently not able to have customized education because they don't have a teacher. But with this, they can. Imagine ChatGPT trained with all MIT courses. And you can log on in the morning and say, hey, I didn't understand this part of the text. And it will clarify everything for you. So it will be able to reach many more people and have more personalized education. Well, I hadn't thought of that. I had thought about how, with the old logic, you could prevent students from copying. But what you're saying is, no, actually, you just have to assess things completely differently. First, it was all about who had the best cursive, and then about who could use the encyclopedia better, or who could use the internet better. And now it's about who is going to be able to use these tools better to come out with the best solution. Well, of course, I remember when the internet came, they said, oh, well, we're going to be out of a job because everyone can Google everything. But we just changed the way we did things. And yeah, we went from encyclopedias, as you said, to searchable databases, and then Google, and then websites where people could also ask questions. So we've seen this whole evolution, and I'm optimistic. I think education, we have an opportunity to personalize it and to provide more opportunities for more people. Okay, my final question, because we have a lot of questions here from people who are following this from the chat, but I'd like to refer to a statement of yours in this paper we mentioned with Santander X. You said artificial intelligence can sometimes be better than humans, but nothing is comparable to a human using artificial intelligence productively. What does that mean? That everyone's going to have to know how to use this ultimately? So is it going to be like knowing how to use a knife and fork or a computer nowadays? So what sort of things or opportunities will all of this bring, so enabling people to do things they can't do today? Well, everyone more or less now knows how to do a Google search, which is not that obvious, and everyone uses Google every day and at work and in our personal lives and so on. And so I think these tools will be the same. We will have an assistant or 500 in our daily lives who will help us to do our tasks in a better, faster, and more effective way. And perhaps something which is a future impact which we should be aware of, but also very interesting, is this hyper-personalization. We will go from, as I was discussing the other day with some colleagues, while we are reading the same paper, why can't we just tell these tools to present that paper in the way we talk, or in a way that will make it easier for us to understand? When people start reading the New York Times, there's a barrier sometimes to understand it, but you could use these tools to simplify it for you. And there are other industries that are going to be modified, definitely content creators and customer service and marketing, definitely, because all ads are pretty similar. Well, perhaps they could be personalized for you. And the deployment of these tools in every device will mean, for example, that we will receive in our mobile phones a year from now or 2 years from now ads that will be completely hyper-personalized according to the way we speak, the way we feel. Another industry that's going to change completely is content creation. I was discussing this with Jorge Alina the other day, who is someone who's helped us with a paper. And that is, we will be able to have films which we ourselves will have created. In fact, there's already some film directors who are saying that in 2 years we will get home and ask Netflix, okay, I want to film with my son as the main character, Marilyn Monroe, about what happened to me today. I don't know what they'll do with the Oscars then. Well, we'll just have an industry that will probably be just as strong as the video game industry, which will be behind that content creation, because ultimately, of course, the difference between the content being better or worse will depend on the creative side of the person behind each one. And there's other sectors that will also change a huge amount. I'm optimistic about the use of these technologies. I think they will be commodified and we will all use them, and we will be doing tasks that will benefit particularly new entrants to different sectors, because it will give them the same level as developers who've been there for years and people who have enormous expertise. And in education, as I said before, I'm optimistic too, because we will be able to reach many more people in a more personalized way.
Si te parece, vamos.
Okay, Phil, shall we move on to the question? We have a lot of questions, actually. As I said, all the dinner table discussions is on this topic, so there's a very good one here. Some, we have the names. This is from Pedro Alvarez, actually. Others are anonymous. So how close are we to have AI, general AI? I suppose that you get a machine, and this machine knows just about everything and use it for whatever you want. Yeah. General AI is the way it differs with the one we have today is that they are self-aware. They know. Well, that's even more scarier. They know about that they exist. They can think. These tools are called stochastic machines that repeat how we speak, but they don't understand what we're saying. They continue to codify how humans they don't know how we talk, but they can codify us. I think we're still far from that. I think we're far still from having general AI tools that can be aware of what they're saying and then retrain themselves. The day we get intelligence of that type, it would be super, super intelligent, far more intelligent than us, because it can, of course, retrain itself. But we're still far from that. This is a step forward in that direction. But don't forget, these tools are just complex ways of coding human knowledge in models that are, simple to use, but they don't really understand themselves. They don't understand what they're doing. So again, with the self-awareness tools, we're so far. With these general AI tools, we're far away from them. Well, I had no idea about that, so I'm learning a lot of things today. Okay, another question is, what is the probability of this technology can take over the use, supplant us, basically, in these of our phones, our applications, or fraud, for example, and banking apps, when you send emails, doing transfers. It is possible. In fact, it is happening. Before we started, we spoke about that. There's many people. The Chat GPT, for example, they replace Linea Cliente, the customer care service. And this can be scaled into many different sectors. So what I'm thinking, what I predict, is that these tools can also work on the other side as well. We can use these tools, like these language models, to be able to talk to these individuals that are trying to, to send us money, whatever. We can actually to help us detect whether it's really a person on the other line, on the end of the line, versus a machine. So right now, what we're seeing in the 6 months is a considerable disequilibrium between the development of the technology and the legal side, and I would even say the application side of it. So right now, there's a lot of mismatch between both, and what we're seeing is that there's considerable, significant problems, big with this sort of identity theft and so on. But I think when this technology becomes more democratic, more accessible, I think what we'll see, like spam, maybe happen like spam. Of course, I remember email. You couldn't use email. It was impossible because 1 or 2 emails you're receiving was just nonsense, something you didn't want, and that's no longer a problem. we've pretty much, through technology, we managed to get rid of it. Well, I still every now and then I still get some, yes, but it's not as bad as it used to. So from a technological point of view, I think we'll have tools. We'll develop tools using the same technology. It's the same technology, but we'll be able to query the system to see whether it's actually an individual on the other line, a machine. And from a legal point of view, there is a proposal EU level and in the US to have more legislation in place for the use, vis-a-vis the use of technologies for these purposes. So that's another area where we can work. Another question here, which is I find quite interesting for all of us who have children, by the way. They say, right, considering how this is going to explode and propagate, how can children that are going to school or university, what do they have to study? To what extent is it important? What do they have to study to get by? Well, I would say, if I have a son at school now, when I went to explain to him about this, he was like, "Yeah, I know, Dad. I know about this already. Thanks." I have the same problem. Maybe it's the age. Yeah, well, what we need to do is make sure they're obviously going to learn by themselves, but also through schools and learn at schools to use these technologies in a responsible way and to use it in a creative way, not just to pass an exam, but to understand how they can use these tools to come up with better projects. For example, being more creative, more ideas or more user cases, for example. I have this problem, but give me more cases where these problems is also being found. So we have to teach these kids also to use these tools in a creative way, not just to solve a problem in a very short run, but also to show them how to use it in a more creative way, in a different way. And we'll have to change, of course. We'll have to change the way we think. I have another question here on the Neuralink brain chip. I don't know what that is. Maybe you do. But it says that it could enable significant improvements for people with disabilities. To what extent is that under development? To what extent is it developed? And how could that impact? That's Vicente asking, how could this help medicine? Well, Elon Musk, as you know, he's talking about this quite a bit, insisting on this. And in medicine, in fact, in my team, in the media lab where I work, there's a lot of people working not just on robotics, on how to use these tools to improve people's lives, but also on developing tools to increase and solve a number of problems. For example, connective tissues. I'm not that familiar with the subject, but I think there's one side that needs to be resolved, which is the biology behind it. On one hand, there's silica, which we know about it, but then the brain is not clear. There's been a lot of progress on how we know the brain operates and works, but there's still we've made a lot of ground there and moved quite a bit, but we still need to figure out how to connect both things, the chips and the brain. But again, I'm not an expert in this technology. That's just from what I hear from my colleagues. Okay, several questions, which I didn't ask you about because I knew that they were going to come up. So questions we got concerning how can this be a risk for people, security, people that believe the Terminator, Skynet, the Terminator, for example, those sort of things. If there's questions addressing that, this is Carlos, I think the rest of them are no names, Alfa Corrales as well, talking about the risk. Is this really over the top? What do you think are the dangers? You're talking about these drones that are being trained, and then they did a simulation that they had to a drone that assassinate the operator because it wouldn't let it reach its target. What's the risk behind this? Well, of course, whenever there's progress in AI, we always get Terminator. There's always Skynet. We see again all these scenes, and it makes sense. And of course, these developments are increasingly happening at a faster and faster pace. And we are heading towards this general AI Artificial intelligence that's aware of itself and can learn. But again, we're still far, very far from that. But I think what we need to do is concentrate and focus, make sure that these tools actually have impact on a number of areas like the ethics, legal grounds as well, what we spoke about in this discussion, in the labor market as well. And I think that's where we need to focus. These are things that are happening now. These algorithms, however, present a problem, is that they're trained in huge databases, enormous databases. But these databases are also can be biased. They have a huge bias. And of course, that biasing is perpetual because it's just because of course you're just working on that bias and you're learning based on that bias. It just perpetuates that bias. So this thing that someone is going to create a drawing connected to ChatGPT, and obviously this can happen. This can happen in all these tools, but I don't think that is the most the most immediate danger. I think ethical, legal, social issues are probably, and economic too. That's probably going to be the biggest problems. I think Banco Santander, organizations, schools, universities, society as a whole have to be prepared, ready to address these challenges, which are here now. And if we don't adapt fast enough, we can run the risk of having sectors, entire industries that will not be able to transition and will disappear, like that's happened with the internet, with the smartphones, with the Industrial Revolution, whole industries that vanished. Also being asked here, if given what we know, what this technology can do, should we put some limits? There's some things that should we come up with sort of standards or norms, or rules, that things that shouldn't do. I suppose that question is arising because there's been some people working in AI that have also suggested we should stop the development of these models, at least for a year, to be able to think carefully, what's happening. I don't think that's the case because it's what's happening, at least the area we're working on. We now are starting to understand how these models work in a better way, and also the problems that these models have. And when you understand how they operate, how they work, then we can also report to the regulator and to society, to enterprises, what are the benefits and what are the issues. And the AI law that the EU Parliament is going to adopt is starting to regulate the use of these tools, general purpose tools, that's what they're called. So these tools will only be able to be used under certain circumstances of context, and in other contexts will be regulated. So, for example, the use of these tools for military purposes or what have you, that will be regulated. That's in Europe. We don't know the context in other countries, but for example, given the way this is evolving in other countries, there will be understanding between the industries that develop it, and ultimately these industries are global. So it's powerful to have these global industries because it will have to develop appropriate legislation in that regard. You mentioned earlier that you're going to assess students based more on creativity, but, however, one of the characteristics of this technology is that it itself can be creative. Isn't that a contradiction? Maybe I didn't explain myself. When we need to assess the questions that the student puts forward, not how he or she answers questions. So the questions they ask are not how they respond to questions. So now we assess how we ask the questions, we see how they answer. Now with these tools, we have to teach the student that they can ask, they can create new things, and how he or she formulates these questions. Do you see the future? Do you think will be more inequality? Do you think inequality will be better or worse? Well, in previous waves of automation, what happened? Again, we're talking about robots here. Automation tools, for example, customer care services. And the thing is, they used people that were blue-collar employees in the U.S. Blue collars are the people that have lower skills, and normally linked to people that had also a lower level of English. So there was considerable backlash on that, not just from the academia, but also from the legislator to try and mitigate the impact, because these automation tools could suddenly leave a lot of people unemployed, people that don't have any other way of earning a living. So this level of automation works on the other is actually in the more creative end, is right on the other end of things. It tasks labor that people that have more skills. I'm not saying it's going to be more inequalities, but I think it's an automation that will operating in a different sector of population and can create more inequality, because the middle class is in fact middle class represents a majority of the labor market in many countries, most countries, but I don't think there's a correlation with inequality in this second wave of automation. And in this past 6 months, what we're finding is that it actually helps people that are going into the labor market, and people that are already in it. So it might actually help people that are, in a country, for example, where they don't have access to these technologies, and might be able to help them. Okay, there's another question in talking about banking. How can elderlies be engaged? How can we engage them in this technology, for example, in banking? Because everything is being transitioned to the digital world. The older people that like to go to a branch, they feel that they're not being served correctly or adequately. So how do you train elderly in these tools? How can you help them adopt this technology? Well, as I said, these technologies present general training, and then what you can do is you can fine-tune them to different contexts or audience. So we're using it in our applications. So ultimately, what you do is you train the small portion of it, and you adapt it to a specific purpose, for a specific purpose. And that's where you're going to adapt these tools for a group of people. But we can even do more. We will have it in our mobile phones, and these tools can learn from what we do on a daily basis, and they can learn and adapt to what we do. So I think these tools can help these people and make life easier for them. It'll definitely make life easier for them, because they're also going to speak their own language, and they're able to respond, answer their questions. If, for example, if you put in ChatGPT and you have a session, ChatGPT is learning from what you're saying. So you get the best answer. That's right. So, if you have GPT for a year, then after a year, ChatGPT will be able to predict what you want. It will talk like you, react like you. This is like hyper customization of a tool to an individual. So in a way, it will be able to solve part of the problem. In the case of these elderlies, they need a different interface to use these tools or banking services. That's when I use ChatGPT, I don't understand anymore, because it seems like it feels like I'm talking to myself. Okay, I have a couple more questions here. We're talking about financial services here now. What do you think are the most immediate applications? You spoke about investment, but these are questions coming from the UK. How can this be applied in the short term to the field of finance? Well, customized service to customers, fund management, market reports, all the processes related to data compilation, and adapting and generate insight with that information for different type of customers or potential customers or potential audience. These processes will be easily automated with these tools. And of course, it's very difficult to differentiate funds. And actually, no, I think that's when the differentiating value of Banco Santande, for example, will show, because these tools, first of all, these tools have to be trained. You have to show them. So I can give all the activities, I can pass on everything it does, all the reports, all the papers, even the one we just developed with you, we wrote with you. But ultimately, the fine-tuning of the tool, so that they can genuinely adapt to the processes and the services that Santander or any financial institution is offering, that will require human beings behind it. In fact, ChatGPT, I don't know if you know this, ChatGPT is two parts. One is GPT, which is trained with text, and then ChatGPT is also trained with text and humans, where humans are chatting with this tool, and they assess how well or how good it would answer. So, I mean, other organizations are doing this. I'm not going to give a name, but some organizations have taken all the experience they have. Imagine the last 20 years of the wealth of information that Santander has had for the last 20 years, and use it in ChatGPT and fine-tune it. Yes, but those of us who work in some of these things, a lot of the technologies, as you said, I mean, you still can't load them on your phone, but you have to keep sending your data, so that you have to send them off somewhere else for it to learn. I think people are a bit scared about this, sending their detailed information. I'm going to send all my reports to somewhere, I don't know where it is, I don't know what they're going to do with it, then it comes back to me. So there's also data protection, which is internal data or information. Yes. In other organizations where I work, they told us not to use ChatGPT to generate content that will be used by customers, and not to include names, because obviously ChatGPT is training with all the material you input. So, and there has been some cases already where the code has been introduced. The code has been introduced, but you're getting actually the chat that individuals having with ChatGPT, and you're viewing that. But I think by year end, up in the cloud, we'll have these models, and not year end, but certainly next year, we'll have a private cloud where we can train these sort of models. And one final question, I don't know how to really formulate the question to make sure that we're not really giving any investment advice here, certainly not me, but I'm being asked, if you were to invest in AI, would you invest in AI companies? I'm not talking about a bank using AI, but companies that are very much focused on using AI. Well, there's a lot of studies. I think, in fact, you mentioned it earlier. Any corporation that uses AI, for example, blockchain last year or a few years ago, with metaverse and so on, any company that's involved with AI, obviously they're going to perform better in the stock exchange. I would invest in the core, the companies that are generating. If OpenAI was a public company, then I'm talking about the companies that are developing the technology. There's many companies that are developing services based on that layer of intelligence, and some companies such as GitHub, that's Microsoft, is using tools so developers can make better use of these technologies, and we're finding that they can provide a differential service. But I would invest in the core companies if they're listed. But I don't want to give any advice on which companies. Okay, well, that's it. Esteban, thank you so much. It's been fantastic to have you here. I hope next year, if we want to repeat this chat discussion, hopefully it won't be mannequins. I hope we can both come here and sit face to face. In other words, humans. But again, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating discussion. I'm sure people were delighted to listen to your comments. And again, thanks for joining us. Thank you, Jose. Thanks so much. Okay, well, if you want to listen to any of these chats, they're available on privatebanking.com. If you want to read the article that Esteban was talking about, that we've developed in Santande Universidades, you can find it in Santander.com. I hope you enjoyed this interview, this discussion. I'm fascinated by this. I'm certainly going to catch up and do more reading. And we'll see you in the next chat of Santande Private Banking in another of our Wealth Talks. Thank you very much. Thank you.